And very much in that vein, please welcome, presenting a brief history of data storage, Eli Holderness.
Hello, London.NET user group. I've never written any .NET at all, but I am here today to tell you some weird history facts. This is me. I am many things, but for the purposes of tonight, what's important is that I'm a real nerd. I used to work at a cloud provider, and we dealt quite a lot with data storage there. And so over the course of my time there, I sort of spent a lot of time thinking about like how and why we stored data. And I went down a lot of rabbit holes. Before we get properly started, this is a tech talk, so we have to ask, what is the thing? What's the thing we're talking about? So the actual concept I'm talking about of data storage is it's hard to pin down. So in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, the detective, Sherlock Holmes, it turns out that he doesn't know that the Earth orbits the sun. And he defends this by saying that his brain is like an attic, and that in order to store this piece of information, the orbit of the Earth around the sun, he'd have to chuck something else out. And knowing that the Earth revolves around the sun isn't very useful to him in his line of work. And obviously our brains don't work quite like this, but the general principle stands. We need to remember more things than we actually have room for in our heads. So hands up who in this room remembers 3 phone numbers by heart? 4? 5? Yeah, okay. Dylan gets them.
Dial-up internet, though.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say it doesn't count. We need to know more things than we can remember, and so we need to store those things somewhere. So to store something, we have to turn it into a physical object. This talk is about how, as a species, we have done and continue to do that, and how computers have impacted our solutions to this problem. So in terms of computers, what I'm going to talk about is non-volatile memory that does not lose its data when it loses its power. Another thing I'm going to touch on is the durability of data storage, which has 2 flavors. Obviously, when you turn knowledge into an object, the durability of that physical object matters. You know, does your book fall apart? But there's another part to it, which is the durability of the encoding that we use when we turn information into an object. If we write a book in a language, we have to be sure that that language is going to stick around for people to be able to read that book in the future. So another more upfront example of this, without taking out your phones, can anybody tell me where this QR code leads? Does anyone want to guess? It's a Rickroll. So, but the point I'm making here is that without a certain specialized technology, in order to be able to decode this piece of data, it's useless. The encoding of the data matters, and our access to that encoding matters. So, what is on the docket for today? We have got old stuff, no electricity, pen and paper, clay tablets, really old stuff. We have.
Age of the Egyptians, with the papyrus.
You will see. We're going to go through it. We have got old things, but with electricity. This is like old age of computing stuff. Really cool things. We have got current things that we know and love, so like CDs, hard drives, flash memory. And finally, for a little bit of fun, I'm going to talk about what the future might hold for storing data. Yeah, well, I hope so. I think it's really cool. Hopefully you will too. So let's look at some stuff that has survived the test of time. First up, we have clay tablets. These were traditionally not fired in a kiln, but instead left to air dry, like the ones that were used every single day. As a result, we don't have a lot of these today. The ones that we do have, the one up there, this one was accidentally fired in like you would in a kiln, but because a guy's house caught fire. As a result, we now know about the guy that this clay tablet is written about. Is a shady copper merchant called Nazir, who lived in about ancient Mesopotamia, 750 BCE. This tablet is considered to be the oldest known written complaint, one of a few that were found in the ruins of this guy's house. It's written in Akkadian cuneiform. That writing system was lost for a very long time. So that what I was talking about with the encodings and data durability of encodings, we lost the ability to read this language for a long, long time. Linguists in the 18th and 19th century spent a lot of time figuring out how to decipher it. So while the physical object is very, very durable, like by accident, the encoding isn't, or at least it wasn't for a long time. It also just cracks me up. They're like, this dude's house caught fire, and now like 3,000, 4,000 years later, we're laughing about him. Sucks to be a Nazir.
Well, he shouldn't have sold that copy.
Exactly, right? So on the other end of the physical durability spectrum, we've got pen and paper, or, ink and parchment, pigments on papyrus, and so on. The encoding is, again, written language, so we have to be able to understand that writing to be able to get the data back out of the object. This is the first 2 pages of the Beowulf manuscript, which was produced sometime between 975 and 1025 Common Era. We don't know when the poem itself was originally composed, and this is the only copy we have. Now, the manuscript formed part of a library called the Cotton Library, named after a guy called Cotton, who had a fondness for old and weird things like me. And for a time, this library was stored in a building called Ashburnham House. Does anybody want to guess what happened to Ashburnham House? It caught fire. Now, unlike clay tablets, it turns out fire is pretty bad for the durability of paper. A lot of this library was either damaged or lost. The Beowulf manuscript did suffer a bit of scorching at the time, and over the subsequent years, it accrued more damage as a result. So that's the only copy of it we have. We've made lots and lots of copies, but the only sort of original, and we don't know when the poem was composed, but that's the only one we've got. So the physical durability of this object really matters, because it would suck to lose the only one. This is all very interesting, but you might be thinking this is supposed to be a tech talk. I thought, what does any of this have to do with technology? I get to share one of my favourite facts with you. The English word for technology comes from the same Proto-Indo-European roots as the word for textiles. Historically, this makes a lot of sense because for a long time, the human problems that we had, what we needed to do was grow enough food, find shelter, and make enough cloth to have clothes and sails for ships and things like this. Textiles were the site of historical technological advancement for a long, long time. If you like to look at medieval manuscripts, as I'm wont to do, you'll often see women with drop spindles. So what she's got there, I do have a laser. What she's got there, that's called a drop spindle. And you can see at the top, there's fibers around it. And this is because if you were a woman in the 12th, 13th, 14th century and you had 5 spare minutes, no, you didn't. You were spinning fabric. You were spinning thread out of fibers. This is where we get the English idiom, spinning a yarn, to mean telling a tale, because women would sit round, spin yarn, and tell each other stories. You can also see that there's a cat there who's bothering her as she's trying to get her work done. If you have a cat and you do any kind of yarn craft, you know that this is absolutely accurate. So, making fabric. In 2nd century China, people invented the draw loom, which is a machine for weaving fabric into thread, and this helped streamline fabric production enormously. You've got this sort of automation of things. And this is great because people need fabric. But we'll make do with boring, plain fabric, but what we really like is fancy patterned fabric. You can make fancy patterned fabric with a regular draw loom. It's pretty labour intensive. You have to select a particular bunch of individual threads each time as you do your weaving. And you have to do that sort of based on colour. And which thread you'll pick up each time varies so that you can create a pattern. If we could somehow encode that pattern into an object that the loom itself could use automatically, this would really bring down the level of labour and the error rate, right? And this is where we get punch cards from. So how this works is as follows. For each thread, you have a little hook that can come up and pick it up or not pick it up. And there's a punch card that will let that hook mechanism be activated. If something can pass through that, it will activate that hook and say, okay, that hook's going to pick up a thread. And if there's no hole in the punch card, that mechanism can't be activated. So your punch card is 1s and 0s. Is this thread going to be picked up or not? And so each time as you pass, so there's what's called a weft, the thing that you weave, goes back and forth, and then there's the warp, which gets separated, and these are the threads I'm talking about that are getting picked up or not picked up. Each time you move that weft through, the punch card will go to the next row and say, these threads get separated. And that way you can automate the colour information in the pattern that you want to weave, and the loom can do it itself automatically. Get it much, much quicker and with a lower error rate. So here is some fabric made with one of these punch card operated looms. The idea behind this was created by a few different artisans and inventors in France in the 1700s, ending with a guy called Joseph-Marie Jacquard. If you want to know more about these things, they are called Jacquard looms. The patterns from the punch card made in the 1700s are still in use today, or from some punch cards, still in use today, which is a big win for data durability there. We know what these things were encoding, and we can still interpret that today, which is really cool. Punch cards will be coming back. Keep it in your head. Film photography. This is anyone here a photography buff? Anyone really into the history of film photography? Yeah. So this is the earliest image derived from a photographic process, or rather on the left is the original photographic plate, and on the right is a colorized version. If you're a film photography buff, you will recognize this. This was created by a guy called Nicéphore Niepce in 1826, and he used a camera obscura, which is like a tiny little pinhole that you can use to project light. He projected that light onto a plate covered in a photosensitive substance, which hardened differently according to how much light hit it. And then you could wash away the bits that were still goopy and be left with the hardened stuff, and you ended up with a texture that represented the light that had hit that plate. Film photography is really, really interesting because as far as data storage goes, the encoding doesn't have human bias in it. It's pretty much like it's a chemical process. Photons hit something photosensitive, cause physical changes, and thereby store a representation of the light that was hitting the plate at that time. Like, photography as an art form, of course, has human bias, and it is, what do we take photos of? How do they make us feel? All of this stuff. And once we get into digitizing photos, we run into all the other problems that we have with digital data. But actual film photography, it's an exceptionally faithful and unbiased record of information, which I think is really, really cool. So this is a daguerreotype, the first publicly available kind of photography. I've included it. This one was taken by Louis Daguerre in the late 1830s. It's very probably the first candid photo ever. If you look there, you can see a guy getting his shoe shined, and you can see the person doing it. They were probably only there for about 4 or 5 minutes, because that's how long this exposure took. But they were the only ones staying relatively still over that time frame, which is really cool. They never knew, probably, and they're probably the first people candidly caught on photo ever. Film photography obviously has continued to progress as a discipline. Daguerreotypes was superseded by collodion photographs, and we've got better photosensitive substances and development processes on and on into the present day. Right, final audio records. These are the first example of a paradigm that's going to come up again and again in this talk, which is that you have a disc and it spins, and there's something recorded on it in a track that's either like a spiral or concentric circles. And you have a head, something you can move around the disc that will sit and it will read data as the disc spins. That paradigm is really, really common in lots of following examples that we'll talk about. So vinyl audio discs have a single spiral track running outwards from the center, and data is encoded on this by sort of variations in the surface. Got a little needle that takes that sort of motion and turns it into an electrical signal, which we can then turn into noise. So the data here, because it's encoded in the texture of the disc, and the disc itself doesn't have a protective casing built in, you have to be super careful with handling them. Is anyone here a vinyl person? Anyone here collect vinyl records, use them? Yep. You are all very familiar with this. We actually get the phrase "like a broken record" to mean repetitive, because if you have a scratch, exactly, if you have a scratch on your record, then it will sometimes cause the needle to skip back a section, and that's where we get the phrase "like a broken record," meaning repetitive, because the same section will be played over and over again. So physically, they're pretty fragile, and the encoding itself can be compromised with things like dust or grease from your fingertips or scratches. Right. Now we are entering the wonderful world of electricity and magnetism and computers. I thought that was applause for a moment. I was like, yeah, electricity. It's punch cards round 2. A guy called Herman Holderness developed machines for tabulating census data for the 1890 US Census, and all that data was stored on punch cards. He later founded a company which got merged with a few others, eventually becoming the corporation we know and love today as IBM. So the concept here is the same as with a loom. A hole in the punch card allows a connection to be made. In the case of Herman Holderness' tabulating machines, that connection was electrical. It was a spring that dipped down and into a pool of liquid mercury. So these were obviously very safe to be around, and yeah. Computing's got a lot better since then. Crunch time is bad, but at least it's not liquid mercury, right? Yeah. Something you might notice is that this punch card has 80 columns. This is where we get today's widespread standard of using 80 character rows. Punch cards for data input, output, and tabulation were eventually superseded by other forms of data storage, like, various kinds of magnetic data storage, which is what we're moving on to talk about now. This is drum memory. Now we are cooking with magnets. Magnetic storage works like this. You have some surface of ferromagnetic material, that's iron, cobalt, nickel, and certain rare earth metals, and you can have them arranged in a crystalline structure. on that surface. And you manipulate the magnetic polarity. You magnetize them differently. And different areas, if it's magnetized one way, that's a 1, magnetized the other way, it's a 0. You can store data in this way by magnetizing certain areas on your surface. Then you take a head and you read off the magnetic data off of that surface. So again, we've got the spinning discs and something to read off it, although in this case, often the heads would be the things that moved around rather than the drum itself. So data is stored in tracks on one of these drums, which are circles around the outside of the drum. So imagine you've got your audio record and it's like concentric circles. Imagine that, but it's 3D instead, and you've got tracks going down it. So this is a Polish one called the ZAM 41. This one has multiple heads for reading and writing. The trade-off here is that, as your head needs to move around the drum to get at data, that takes time. If you're using one of these for the primary data storage, like essentially the RAM, the working memory of your computer, you really care about that amount of time that's being spent. It's called seek time. You've said, I want to read from here. How much time does it take that head to physically move and get there? If you have more heads, less time. But they're very expensive to manufacture. So you have this trade-off between cost and speed, something that, comes up again and again in computing, right? So, this one has this was the example I could see with the highest number of read-write heads, essentially. But yeah, there's a trade-off there. And obviously in terms of the encoding, we're now talking about binary. You've got your magnetism one way or the other. If you don't know how to interpret that binary, the drum is useless. So you need to make sure that your encoding is something that your computer actually understands. Here are some magnetic cores. This was the dominant form of random access memory storage for decades. It was so ubiquitous, it was often referred to as core memory or just core. You've got all of these little rings of magnetic material, and they represent bits, and their magnetic state is manipulated by these wires that run through them. When you pass a current through those wires, it can change the polarity of the magnetism of those cores. When you read from these, if you want to get the state out of it, you actually destroy that state. It's called destructive readout. If you want to get the memory out of this, if you want to get the data out of this, you have to destroy the data in it. One neat fact about this piece of memory, it was heated, not cooled, to make it more efficient. So the actual constraint here is that it needs to be at a consistent temperature rather than a cool temperature. And it's a lot easier to heat things up to a consistent temperature than to cool them down. So if you find that your PC is getting a little bit hot, you can make use of that and install some core memory in there and take advantage of all that extra heat. This is where we get the phrase core dump, by the way, because this is essentially RAM, but when the power was lost to the computer, it didn't lose that state. You could go and look at what the working memory of your computer looked like. And that's why you say, okay, my computer's died, but I can still get the core dump out of it. I can see what was happening at the time that it died. Using smaller and smaller cores and wires allowed this memory to reach higher and higher sort of data density, but manufacturing it became very labor intensive, and it was done by hand. For working memory, it was essentially superseded by RAM, which I'm not talking about because that's volatile memory. Here's one of my favorites. This is a piece of software. Core rope memory is what it's called. This is a form of read-only memory. The process of writing to it is done during construction. The topology of the wires, as they thread in and out of those loops, encodes ones and zeros. So to update the software, you have to go and do a lot of unpicking and rewiring and rethreading. This type of memory got the name LOL memory, little old lady memory, because the process of manufacturing it looked like knitting and other kinds of thread crafts. If anyone wants to come and talk about knitting later, come and talk to me about knitting, I love it. But it's really, really cool because you can't, in order for this to get a bug, it's not like, something loses its magnetism. It's actually the topology. You'd need to cut a wire or something. The most famous use of this was in the Apollo missions, precisely and specifically because it was so stable. What you've written to this memory, that's not coming undone unless somebody goes in and threads and unthreads stuff. Right. Floppy disks. I remember them. I feel old putting them in the historical section. So seen here in 8-inch, 5¼ inch and 3½ inch sizes, these were the latest and greatest in removable media storage from the mid-1970s to the early 2000s. They're called floppy. Who has taken a floppy disk out of its case before? Yeah. That's why they're called floppy disks, is because the floppy magnetic material that's in the inside, they've got this, again, they're a spinning disk. Anyone who hasn't taken one outside of its case, this is what they look like. If you pick it up and shake it, it goes boom, 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 boom. It's great. Closer up, it looks like this. This is a close-up visualization of the data encoded on a floppy disk. You can see the bits are sort of light and dark there. Those are ones and zeros. That's encoding on the magnetic surface. This was imaged with a magnetic field camera. So, yeah, that's really cool. And you can see that it's kind of a spiral. You can see that those aren't quite straight lines, right? It's a spiral out and, further and further out. Yeah, don't do this. Because it's magnetic encoding, if you bring a magnet too close to your floppy disk, you will wipe all the memory that's on it. This is sort of, I remember as a kid growing up, it's like, don't bring a magnet too close to your phone or your laptop or whatever, and this is why, because it will wipe the memory. Something about the spinning disk method is this. You've got sectors. Data is addressed by sectors, and that's the thing that looks like a slice, a pizza slice. And then within that, you've got it addressed by tracks, which are those lines, those curved lines there. And those are, the concentric rings coming out from the center. So here we've got a representation of two tracks within a sector. Within each sector, for each bit of track, you store the same number of bytes, the same amount of information. And it looks like this. At the center, they're more compressed. And that means at the edges, you're not using all the space you could be. And the reason I'm putting this I'm making this remark within the floppy disk section is because Apple experimented with fixing this in floppy disks. Early Macintosh computers, they had a system where you could spin the disk more slowly when you're reading and writing data that's closer to the edge, be more efficient with the space that you had, which is really cool. You're making good use of the magnetic medium that you have, but it requires special drivers and special circuitry and disks. And if you wrote a disk with using the sort of regular method, you couldn't read it on a computer that was expecting it to spin more slowly at the outer edge. So eventually they reverted back to the model we see here, where the disk spins at constant angular velocity. Again, the encoding that you use matters. If you encode something in a way that can't be read by other people, it's not worth doing, or you've not stored data. Before computing environments were regularly networked, these were the go-to method for data transfer between different computers. Of course, this legacy lives on with the floppy disks having become the global symbol for a save button. All good things come to an end, and other data storage formats became more competitive in terms of speed and cost and density of storage. In February 2003, we are in 23. In February 2003, over 20 years ago, Dell announced they would no longer pre-install floppy disk drives on their flagship home computer models. You can still get them upon request. By 2007, only 2% of computers sold in stores had built-in floppy drives. The era of the floppy disk is coming to an end. Wikipedia calls them obsolescent, which I think is a great term. However, if you love the floppy disk, don't worry, they'll still be around for a little bit. This article is from October 2019. If you ever worry that the technology you know and love is getting old, you maybe need to reskill in like AI or WASM or whatever. Don't sweat it. Somewhere in the world, governments are going to be using your technology of choice for at least the next 30 years. And they're not quite dead yet. I went on Amazon and I looked at external floppy disk drive readers. I could only find them for 3.5 size floppy disks, and I couldn't find them with USB-C adapters, only USB-A. But if I wanted to, I could get a floppy disk and I could put it in there and I could read off, the homework that I did when I was in year 8 or whatever. Wikipedia says it's obsolescent. What a great word. We are now into the modern day. Today I'm going to be talking about the stuff that we actually use here and now. We have more spinning disks, optical disks. So hands up who has a desktop PC with an optical drive in it? Yep. Hands up who owns a gaming console with an optical disk in it?
Console?
Yeah, a gaming console, like a PS5, Xbox, whatever.
6.
Yeah. So this is why it's you don't think about using these for your computers, but they are absolutely still around, mostly in gaming. I'm grouping a bunch of different technologies here under the optical disc heading. Things like Laserdisc, CD-ROMs, writable CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray, so on. They all follow basically the same format, and they all use the spinning disc with a head reading off it paradigm. On optical discs, you've got data encoded with bumps and dips on this polycarbonate layer. Within the disk, as you can see on this really crunchy JPEG that I found. Disks representing the same data can actually be mass-produced mechanically. You can make a print, and you can just print them out. Then that polycarbonate layer is coated with something, usually aluminium to make it reflective, then a layer of lacquer on top of it to protect it. And this is why CDs of your favorite band's latest album are really cheap to produce, because you can just mass produce them. Here we can see a detector. This is the thing that reads off your CD. This is from an Acer laptop's optical disk drive, specifically a CD drive, I think. In optical disk drives, the thing that reads is a laser diode paired with a laser detector. What it's detecting is how reflective the disk is at a given point. So your bumps and your dips reflect differently, and that's what the detector is picking up on. In CD-ROMs, ROM for read-only memory, like core write memory, these were developed by Sony in 1894, and it wasn't until 97 that we got ones that you could rewrite on at home. Now, here is a rewritable CD. And you might notice it's much darker, its surface, its iridescent surface is much darker. That's because in this one, the thin coating of metal isn't aluminium. In CD-ROMs, it's usually made out of, in ROMs, which you can't write to, it's aluminium. But in rewritable ones, it is a silver indium antimony tellurium alloy. Try saying that 6 times fast. What that does is it means that the laser diode in your disk drive can actually melt that metal layer. And it goes from being crystalline to being kind of sludgy. And its reflectivity changes, which means that you can change the property that the disk is actually reading when it tries to read data. You can write to it. But in order to reverse that change, you have to heat the disk up really hot and rewrite all of it at once. So you can write to it once, and then you have to erase the whole thing. And this is, I think, where we get the terminology of burning a CD, because it gets it really hot if you're rewriting to it all at once, or blanking it all, essentially. Now, reading data out of an optical disc requires that it looks good optically. The surface has to be legible to that laser. And unlike floppies, optical discs don't have a built-in casing to protect them, so they'll get scratched, they'll get fingerprints all over them. I think we've all probably experienced this. You can also straight up break them. This is a still from the Slow-Mo Guys video of them shattering a CD by spinning it really, really, really fast. This is the moment when it shatters. I've never broken a CD quite that dramatically, but something I want to note here is that with some analog data formats, let's say we have a clay tablet and it's shattered, I could piece that back together and maybe figure out what it was saying. You can't do that with a CD, you can't do that with a vinyl record. Once something like this is broken, it's game over. You can't come back from this kind of physical degradation of the medium. But even with a punch card, you could maybe piece it together and then take the data of it and make a new punch card to duplicate it. You can't do that here. Right, magnetic tapes. Here is an example of a data storage medium which is not random access. So hard drives and flash memory and CDs and vinyl, whatever, you have a fairly constant time to be able to access anywhere within that storage medium, right? You can move the head and now it's there. With tapes, you have to rewind. If you want to rewind to somewhere, let's say you're 25% of the way through something and you want to access something that's all the way at the end, it takes a while, or rewinding VHS tapes before you gave them back to the video rental place. So tapes made of ferromagnetic material. We all know how this goes by now, magnetized differently in order to represent bits. The hardware that reads and writes to tapes is called a tape drive. And the first magnetic tapes were used to record computer data in 1951 for the UNIVAC 1. And IBM pretty quickly followed suit and set the standards for the industry. Magnetic tapes have been in pretty constant use ever since. And although they have that drawback of having long random access time, they're not good for when you need to access something quickly. But they are very, very cheap to produce. They're durable magnetism-wise, and they're also removable from their surrounding hardware. So if you want to store something on a CD or on a tape, you can actually take it out and have it completely air-gapped, essentially. They're very, very resistant against computational attack if you've got data that's kind of just sitting on a tape somewhere. So the reason that I bring this up is because they are often used for cold storage. Who here has stuff from, or their company does stuff in cold storage in a cloud company? Ah, okay. So I used to work at a cloud company, and we had the reason I wrote this talk is because of our glacier storage class, which I thought was really cool. What that is when you have data that you need to keep hold of for, legal reasons or whatever. So I don't know.
It's basically for mainly for archiving.
Yeah, exactly. Archival, you want to keep...
Years, and then you're going to destroy it.
Exactly. So, you might need to keep financial data for, say, 7 years or whatever, but you don't want to spend expensive storage space on that. So you shove it somewhere where the data storage is cheap. You don't need to be able to access it quickly. Magnetic tapes are great for this purpose. So a lot of cloud storage places, so Amazon will have some, Microsoft has some. The place I used to work called Scaleway had a Glacier storage class, which is, we put your stuff on a tape and it might take up to 24 hours for you to get at it because we need to send a guy to go and put the tape in the tape drive. Cold storage. And that's an acceptable constraint for that kind of usage, which means that magnetic tapes are really great for that. However, I have a note of caution, and it's not really about magnetic tapes, it's about data durability. One of the most famous examples of something called the digital dark age was with the 1976 Viking lander. NASA put a lander on Mars. You can see here Carl Sagan with a replica. They didn't actually send him to Mars as well, unfortunately, because that would have been really cool. It recorded a bunch of data to magnetic tapes. NASA got the tapes back, 1976, 1977, whenever, and then they put them in a cupboard for 10 years. And when they finally got around to trying to read them, all the people who had worked on the original lander had either retired or died. So they had to go back to the actual physical hardware of the lander and try and reverse engineer how that data was encoding and what it encoded and what it represented. They lost the encoding. They had all the binary, they had all the data, just ones and zeros, but they couldn't interpret it, right? And if those original engineers had written down what they were doing at the time, or if NASA hadn't lost maybe they did and NASA lost the bits that they wrote down, whatever, but they very nearly lost all of the data from that trip, the entire purpose of doing it, because they put it in a cupboard for 10 years.
Well, that's NASA view, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's not because it was magnetic tapes. In fact, magnetic tapes probably saved the day there because they're quite durable in terms of, they don't lose their magnetism over time. They managed to stay in a cupboard for 10 years and not get, corrupted or, whatever. But yeah, data durability, it's important. Write down how you're encoding things, document your stuff. Right, more spinning disks, hard drives. We all know them, use them, love them. You get them built into most personal computers these days, unless you're an SSD-only person. You can get external ones that you can fill with lots of pirated media. I checked the other day, it looks like 26 terabytes, or 20 terabytes is about as high as it goes commercially. Wikipedia says 26 are available last year, but I couldn't find them. These work, again, same paradigm as floppy disks and optical media and vinyl. Thing spins around, another thing reads off it. And the medium is, again, magnetic storage. So don't put your electromagnets too near these either. Once again, it was IBM who pioneered these, and these are the first, are these the first ones? The first ones came out in 1957, and they stored a whopping 3.5 megabytes of data. Yeah, these are the original ones. You can see two of them here. They had 52 disks each, and one arm holding two read-write heads. Yeah, there's 7.5 meg of data in that photo. IBM kept iterating, improving on the designs and the hardware. They briefly flirted with a model that had one read-write head per track, the IBM 2305, meaning that there's no seek time as you move heads in order to read and write data. But these turns out to be incredibly expensive, and they stopped making them. And over the 1980s, hard disk drives went from being a very expensive add-on to PCs to being just the standard thing that you got. Modern hard drives, this is really cool, I really like this. Modern hard drives have got to the stage where the areas of the disks that we're magnetizing have got so small that they risk losing that magnetic state due to an effect known as superparamagnetism, whereby heat can cause magnetic material to flip its polarity in areas smaller than 50 nanometers. Nanometers are tiny. For reference, the thickness of a piece of copy paper is anywhere between 70,000 to 180,000 nanometers thick. So we're talking minuscule here, like really tiny. So to counter this, disks now actually have two layers of magnetic material separated in the middle by a 3-atom thick layer of ruthenium, which is not magnetic. And these two magnetic layers are magnetized oppositely to each other, and so they stick and they reinforce each other. I just love that, we made the magnets too small and the universe doesn't like it. That's so cool. That's so cool. So going back... It's really cool, isn't it? So going back to the place I used to work, which I worked at when I wrote this talk, but this is cool, so I kept it in. This is a data bunker 25 meters underneath Paris, which is actually fairly close to the range where the Paris catacombs are. I don't know how close this is to them. This is where Scaleway, who I used to work for, keeps its glacier storage, which is cold storage. Now, I originally thought that it must be magnetic tapes because most cold storage is, but Scaleway actually uses hard drives for it. The hard drives in this bunker operate differently to most that you can buy commercially. So when you think about recording data onto disks in tracks, you can imagine it like a paintbrush kind of going round and round and round. And then you have to move the paintbrush out, either it's a spiral or you have to move the paintbrush out further and further and you make a bigger circle. Now, in order to read data from that surface, it doesn't need as big a space as is written to. You're painting with a very wide paintbrush, but you only need to be able to see a very thin strip of colour, right? And so the way that they record to these drives is, so with the paintbrush, and then you don't overlap those paintbrush circles at all, that's called parallel magnetic recording. The ones here do a thing called shingled magnetic recording, and that is where you paint your first circle, and then you move a little bit out, but not all the way, and you overlap slightly with the line that with the track that you just recorded, and you leave a thin strip that can be read from, and you minimize the area that you need to write to. And so then you move further a little bit out. And it's like you've got sort of these, like shingles on a roof. And I haven't been able to find a way to do a good diagram for this. So if anyone wants to come and help me workshop that, I would love that. But it's called shingled magnetic recording. And what it means is that you can't write randomly in the middle of it because you'll end up overwriting loads of like thin little strips of color. But you get much better data density on the medium, magnetic medium that you're recording to. With cold storage, you're often writing lots and lots of stuff at once. You're not going in and amending stuff. So that's a fine trade-off to have for these systems. I just thought it was cool. I think Seagate accidentally sold a disk drive that was using shingled magnetic recording commercially without labeling it properly, and it was a whole thing. Because again, if you can't read and write, like you need a separate kind of disk drive to do that. The disk drive that you have on your computer won't do that. Yeah, it's cool. Right. Last but not least, in the current storage section, we have flash memory. You have some of this in your pocket probably. It's in smartphones, it's in tablets. If you've got a YubiKey or a two-factor authentication token, that's got some flash in it probably as well. They work by using a circuit component called a floating gate MOSFET, which is extremely complicated, but essentially what it does is it stores charge, stores electrical charge. The drive will draw power from whatever computer that it's connected to, whether that's over USB or it's like integrated into a wider device like a smartphone. And for removable devices, this is great because they don't need an external power source like a large hard drive does. And so when you store charge in the MOSFET, it's a 1 or a 0, right? It's got charge or it doesn't. Flash drives have some limitations and drawbacks. For a given block of storage, you can only really write to it all at once, not in patches. They also have a lifetime limit on how many sort of charging cycles each of the MOSFETs have. Because they wear out over time. Like as you're filling it with charge and then removing charge, they take wear essentially. To mitigate this, flash drives have this like little controller, memory controller, which essentially tries to like level out how much the wear happens across the entire piece of flash memory. This is called wear leveling. Those MOSFETs will also leak over time, regardless of how much wear they've taken. If you have a USB flash drive, put some data on it, and leave it in a drawer for 10 years, like NASA did with the Viking lander tapes, you might not be able to get good data out of it after those 10 years. It might be a little bit garbled. They're not durable over long time periods physically, unlike magnetic tapes or hard drives or clay tablets. So we have learned all about history and the current state of data storage. We know a bit more about how and why the various types of data storage we use today are used the ways that they are. All of the current methods of storage we've talked about they're going to get incrementally better as we go on. We'll improve the lifetime wear limit of flash memory. Hard drives will keep getting bigger and better, and I'll be able to fill them with more pirated media. But none of that is like cool or futuristic. I want to talk about cool and futuristic stuff. So, DNA. DNA is really, really, really data dense. Microscopically small cells can hold the entire genetic code for their species. A team at Los Alamos National Laboratory created an encoding, the adaptive DNA storage codex, and that turns computer-friendly binary into DNA-friendly pairs of A, C, T, and G bases. The idea is that you can create synthetic DNA representing that data, and then that DNA can be stored very durably at low temperatures for decades. We can do this today. It's just not very efficient in terms of, time. There are lots of different encodings that people are working on that have different trade-offs. So, maybe you want it to be faster, but you're willing to sacrifice error correction or all sorts of things like this. There's lots of people working on this. There's DNA data on the moon, courtesy of the Bereshit lander in April 2019. It did crash, so we don't know if that data is actually good. Maybe that data is lost. If it isn't, then the Arch Mission Foundation, who organised that part of the Bereshit lander mission, they built and sent the lander. They estimate that it could be legible in billions of years. It's very cold on the moon, so the DNA will be very stable there. I just think that's really, really cool. There's DNA on the moon, but it's like synthetic DNA. When I was originally researching this, I thought that I thought DNA data storage was going to be about, we've put, I don't know, the original worm virus into sunflowers or something, and now we're going to grow it and we're going to have bio memory. Because one of the things that DNA is very good at is self-replicating with a fairly low error rate. So that may be somewhere that this goes in the future. We're not doing that right now. Right. This is Superman storage, named after the Kryptonian memory crystals in the DC universe. This is also known as 5D optical data storage. Both of those are marketing terms. 5D, it's called 5D because how it works is that you take a bit of transparent, non-photosensitive material, something like fused quartz or toughened glass, and you use a laser to engrave data within it. And the way that they try and call it 5D is that you have 3 spatial dimensions. You've got up and down, left to right, forward and back. And then you have what angle are you viewing it from as an extra degree of freedom. And then you also have how close is it to you as an extra degree of freedom. And I think this is a bit tenuous, but it's a good name. So 5D optical data storage. This photo that you can see here is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights engraved into a piece of glass. Both Hitachi and Microsoft have been working on this, and the current bleeding edge is being developed at a team in Southampton University here in the UK. All of those teams that are working on this, they're doing so with the explicit goal of data durability. This data isn't going anywhere unless you drop the glass, which you can absolutely do, so they should never give it to me, I'm really clumsy. And as long as the encoding used to turn data into this object persists and is known, then this could last thousands, tens of thousands of years. Maybe the human rights, and we haven't settled on an encoding system yet, which is, perhaps rightly, because it's a really important part of this whole process. For all I know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is just there in 7-bit ASCII. But if we know how to decode that in 1,000 years, we'll be able to use this piece of glass to retrieve it, and that's pretty cool. Right, the last one, and this is probably my favorite bit of the talk. It's definitely the weirdest. Let's learn about time crystals. Do we have any condensed matter physicists in the room? I was really worried someone was going to raise. I've had people raise their hand before. I've had people raise their hand before, and I was like, I'm so sorry about what I'm going to do to your beautiful profession. This up here is not a time crystal. There's no good photos of them, unfortunately. This is a space crystal, and you, like flash memory, you have some of this in your pocket. This is silicon. The thing that makes it a space crystal is that it has a repeating structure in space. Its physical structure repeats over and over again. Time crystals are the same, but for time. They have repeating structures in time. This is the best image I could find to try and get this concept across. A time crystal is an object whose lowest energy state, its resting state, is one of motion. This doesn't break the conservation of energy because something quantum physics. They were first theorized to exist in
Definitely need a physicist
yeah.
in the back of the car.
I had a brief moment where I did understand these and went into a fugue state reading the Wikipedia page, and now I've lost the understanding. But these were first theorized to exist in 2012 by a theoretical physicist called Franz Wilczek. And in 2021, only 9 years later, a team of scientists in the University of Hamburg actually made one in a lab. It didn't look like what you'd think of as a crystal. It was a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is something you can get when a supercooled boson gas, when you supercool boson gases. I hate it when I've opened my freezer and I found out I've made a Bose-Einstein condensate again. The reason that they're in this talk is because some very clever people think we might be able to use them as some sort of memory storage for quantum computers, which is currently an open problem. Incidentally, in fun fact, in quantum theory, there's something called the cloning theorem, which means that you can't duplicate a quantum state, you can only transfer it. So any operation reading from a quantum memory storage solution is intrinsically destructive. You have to transfer that state out, you can't duplicate it. Like core memory, destructive readout. Things change and they stay the same. These are really, really cool. If you want to have a trip, go read the Wikipedia pages for them. There's a couple of different kinds. There are some that can only exist while you're firing a laser at them repeatedly, and they don't absorb any energy from the laser, but somehow it's still necessary for it to exist. Really trippy stuff, really cool. People have actually made them in labs. Amazing. And hey, maybe when we've all got quantum computers in our pockets, we'll all have these in them too. So, conclusions. We've learned all about storing data, all the way from customer complaints in the Bronze Ages, all the way to encoding stuff in data and putting it on the moon. This is an incomplete whistle-stop tour. Most of what I wanted to impart is that humans are really cool, creative, and we're good at making increasingly complicated things. But if there's another takeaway from this talk, it's that data is useless if you can't use it, if you can't read it. When we make decisions about how and where to store our data, it has to be with durability in mind. And if we store data, we should probably make sure that other people know how to read it. I'm looking at you, 1976, Viking Lander team. You have to bear in mind, all of this is useless. Another person can make use of it. Maybe your future self, maybe somebody else. And this applies to all sorts of things. When you write code, document it. If nobody else knows how to use it, But yeah, history is cool. Weird science facts. That's been me. That QR code is not a Rickroll. That is a link to a form where you can give me feedback, just anonymously. It's a free text field. I love giving this talk. Help me make it better. Give me some feedback. Thank you very much.